One of the most dangerous moments in our history for at least 2 generations. That is the devastating conclusion of one of the preeminent experts on conflict, on war, which is my brilliant guest, Paul Rogers, who is an emeritus professor of peace studies at Bradford University. Have I got that right? I just from memory. Have I got that correct?
Yes,
that's the title.
Correct.
Yes. Paul Rogers, someone I always embarrass him by knowing, had a big influence on me from my period as a school, literally as a schoolboy, when I studied his work on conflict, and it always had a huge impact on me in terms of what he wrote subsequently on of course, Iraq, the so-called war on terror. We spoke obviously extensively on Israel's genocide in Gaza. And people are always very, very appreciative of everything you have to say. So it's a real honor for you to join us again.
Thank you. Thank you.
So before we came on air, or we started recording, you told me, it was quite striking what you said in terms of just how dangerous this moment is. Can you just explain why is it so dangerous?
I think the main reason is you've got to look at what has happened so far. There was clearly a sort of a plan A, both by the Israelis and by the Americans, and that was regime termination. So you actually start the war by assassinating the leader and as many of the senior people as he can. And that was done in a very violent but brilliant operation, if you can use that term, really in the first hour or two of this conflict. Now, the expectation was that essentially the leadership, the system of Iran would just fall apart, and that there'll be some sort of chaotic situation, regime change, and the probability of a regime which might be sufficiently acceptable to enable the United States and especially Israel to be completely confident that they were in control, and that even more important, Iran's nuclear capabilities would be ended more or less for certain. Now, that has not happened. Plan A did not work, and there's very little sign of it going to work now. The regime seems fairly well established. It does look like there's going to be a new head, Ayatollah, probably the son of the late Ayatollah, who, although he is not that well known, has pretty good contacts within senior circles across Iran. And the end result of that is you have to turn to Plan B. And the real problem here is that, as far as we can tell, the United States, the Trump administration, did not really have a plan B, at least not at the political level. I've no doubt that the senior military in the Trump administration had a lot of different plans. They thought it through. But as far as the politicians are concerned, they had not. And of course, Trump himself is so unpredictable that it's difficult to tell what that means for the start. At the same time, the Israelis really did think it through and really had a second plan B, if you like. Plan B, as far as we know, seemed to have two components. One was you had to do some way of sort of dismantling the regime and forcing it to give in. That probably meant trying to help the groups that are in Iran, like the Kurds and like the Baluchis, who are already opposed to the regime, helping them by basically providing all sorts of support for them to do it. But much more important than that was actually what would actually happen to Iran itself. And this is where we came to the whole issue of what is Israel's normal war doctrine. How would it fight a conflict like this? Take a couple of minutes to go into it, but I think it really would be good. And it's known as the Dahiya doctrine. Now, to go back, you had to go back to particularly the war in Lebanon, back I think it was 2006. And essentially at that time, the Israelis had gone into southern Lebanon to try and get rid of a lot of the rocket launchers. And they also went in for a major series of air raids. So it's a combination of air power and troops on the ground. The troops on the ground took casualties, quite serious casualties. And what happened was that the air power was directed then more at trying to destroy the headquarters of Hezbollah, its real strength, which was in the district of Dahiya, which is basically really a suburb of Beirut to the south of the city center. And they did that. It didn't really work. And eventually the war came to an end and the Israelis more or less withdrew. They thought very seriously about that and came to the conclusion that essentially the people in some of the think tanks were saying, well, next time we face a conflict like that, we've actually got to do it in a different way. we have to accept that you have to go for the civilian population. In other words, you make life so difficult for the supporters of whoever is leading the whole place to actually be prepared for the leaders really to more or less give in. And that could be on a very large scale. Now, that was not employed really then at that time. But of course, when you had all the conflicts between the Israelis and successive groups in Gaza, and what we have, what was it, 4 wars, 2008-9, 2012, 2014 and 2021. 2014, I think it was one where the Israelis were trying to get rid of some of the launch systems, and that meant going underground. And they found that extremely difficult in Gaza. And as a result, they took heavy casualties. The elite Golani Brigade, in particular, was really quite badly affected by this. Not large numbers, but significant numbers. In those 4 wars through to 2021, the Palestinians took huge losses. Large numbers of buildings, houses killed, destroyed, about 5,000 Palestinians killed. But the Israelis, for them, took something like 350 people killed, mostly military. Now, that seems sort of small compared with the massive Palestinian losses, but for Israel, that was far too many. So when you actually came to the start of the most recent war, in October of 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, the Israelis adopted very different tactics. Then they went full tilt for the whole civil infrastructure, including many civilian casualties in Gaza. And the idea was they were not going to go into street fighting against Hamas, which would be to the advantage of Hamas. Instead of that, they were going into destroying, well, to some extent, destroying the infrastructure of the society. So you had, I think all of the universities, I think there were 10 at the time, and senior colleges of education, they were basically, certainly damaged, if not destroyed, in a matter of a few days. Water plants, sewage plants, anything to do with the running of the sort of semi-state, which was, of course, in the hands of the administrative arm of Hamas, they were fair targets. And essentially, within 2 months, I think, the casualties were quite incredible. I mean, something like, I think, 60% of all the houses and flats in the whole of Gaza were damaged, and probably 40,000 or so were actually destroyed. And the casualties, the human casualties, were huge as well. I mean, you're talking about 16,000 people killed in the first 2 months. Most of them were civilians. Many of them, many thousands, were children, and some hundreds were actually infants below the age of 1. So this is a very sort of tough area. But essentially, even that, as we see since, did not work. Hamas was never fully destroyed. And even now, Hamas controls parts of ruined Gaza. Now, that's the background to what is happening now. Now, in some ways, the Israelis are finding a similar problem of a different kind with Iran, because Iran, even 7 days into the war, is still able to launch a barrage against Israel and against other targets there and in other countries. Now, most of these missiles and drones, armed drones, do not get through, but at the same time, enough to cause problems. And Israel is going to find it extremely difficult to really demolish the regime by these means, but it will try. And in fact, you're seeing the sheer level, the volume of bombing going on now as evidence of that. And it seems to me pretty clearly that at least the more hawkish elements within the United States, within the whole Trump administration, buy into this fully. And you see Hexit, who has this extraordinary style of speaking, which is basically almost a sort of adolescent feeling cross and feeling powerful. But essentially, he's making it clear that they're going to do a huge amount of bombing. So they want to take apart as much as they can of a state 4,000 years old in some ways, with 92 million people. Now, that is going to require an awful lot of bombing, but that is what is seeming to be started. And they're hoping that pretty quickly that will have the desired effect. It is just possible that it might do, but I really very much doubt it, because what appears to be happening is, while there is a lot of opposition to the regime in Iran, there's no doubt that many people were killed in the protests fairly recently, just last month. Even so, on balance, as you find this in other circumstances, the population will tend to come in behind the leadership and blame whoever is attacking them. And I think that is probably going to happen. So I know it's a very long answer, Owen, but at the same time, I think it puts it in the perspective of what we're facing now. It's a very dangerous period. I think people need to realize, and it puts the British government, I might say, it might be time to talk about this, in a pretty difficult position, because what is happening in Iran, as far as we can see, is a huge amount of explosive violence and a lot of people getting killed, and that will continue unless, a miracle happens and there's some way of ending the war quickly.
I mean, just in terms of talking about aerial bombardment in general, as a kind of strategy of war, I mean, it's never succeeded in its aims if regime change is your end, has it? There's never been a case in history of aerial bombardment causing a change in regime. Is that correct?
I don't know. I mean, it's possible. I mean, it hasn't been used much, of course, in that context. But if you look at the other ones, it hasn't succeeded. There's been a form of it in Ukraine from the Russians. The Russians essentially were able to force a kind of change in an internal conflict in it would have been the Second Chechen War. But more generally, no, it does not seem to be the way in which you can actually achieve, well, a lasting peace. And even if you achieve an end to a conflict and change a regime, there'll be huge amount of anger and bitterness left behind. Just as we're seeing, with the destruction in Gaza, what Israel is doing is paradoxically making itself less secure. I mean, it is said of Israel, I think it's a very interesting way of putting it, is that Israel has to be, permanently secure, yet permanently insecure at the same time. Impregnable in its security, but always insecure, because the fundamental problem of the competition with Palestinians, a legitimate competition for land, is not going to be resolved by the Israelis. And so you're in this extraordinary position in which it's almost certain that tactic will not work. And even if it was to work, what are you left behind? One of the things is that Israel has got itself into a trap, which I don't think most people realize. And that is, once it has started a full-scale war, it simply has to achieve an end which involves the irreversible prevention of Iran ever developing nuclear weapons. Nothing less than that will do. If, for example, the war comes to an end quite soon, but maybe Trump is told you're on a complete loser here, cut yourself out of it, and Israel reluctantly has to agree to some sort of ceasefire, that is no good, because the last thing Israel wants is any kind of Iran under any kind of regime sympathetic to the current setup in any way. Well, the first thing it will do is to try and develop one crude nuclear device. And I'm not a specialist in that precisely, but certainly looking at what analysts who can be confident about this, that will probably be capable relatively quickly, unless there's been even more destruction of the nuclear systems. Remember that Trump claimed completely wrongly that, the whole nuclear program of Iran had been destroyed in the attack last year. It hadn't. And that's very clear. And essentially, that could be reassembled. In particular, there's a large quantity of fairly highly enriched uranium. And that is almost certainly, much of it may have been destroyed by the bombing, although we don't know, there's no evidence of radioactive leaks. But almost certainly that was dispersed in many different parts of Iran. So essentially, it would not be difficult to do. And this is why Israel has got itself into its own trap. And I think very few people realize it, except maybe some of the senior military who can be very sharp in their own way, and they may be facing a degree of consternation about what comes next.
Well, I mean, in terms of that, what comes next, we've obviously seen extensive reporting of proposals by both the US and Israel to arm militia groups from the Kurdish minority, but not just. Also, there's other minorities, Balochi and so on. I mean, that raises a specter of balkanization, of fragmentation. And, there's a lot of very sound evidence pointing in one direction, which is that Israel would be content with a Iran which collapses into violent chaos, which fragments. So it becomes permanently eliminated as a strong strategic power, because obviously Iran is it's got 93 million people or so. It's the 17th most popular nation on earth. It could always be, in theory, because you could get in theory a so-called friendly Iran, but they had that, didn't they? I mean, Iran was an ally of the West until 1979, and then shifted. So there's always that danger from the perspective of Israel, that even if there's a friendly Iran from our interest, that could change. And they're a formidable country in theory, so better to permanently weaken them and fragment them. Do you think that's what's going on?
It may be. I think that may be, at least on a temporary basis. But there are two huge problems with that. First, remember a little bit of history. Essentially, this is the way in which the Afghan war was fought after 9/11. It's October, November, December of 2001. What was done was to use the Northern Alliance as the ground troops in a conflict against the Taliban. And it seemed to work. In fact, in January 2002, Bush gave his famous State of the Union address. It's worth listening to again, even now, in which he extended the quotes war on terror beyond Afghanistan to Iraq, Libya, and of course, Iran. And in some ways, that is what is happening now, at least as far as Iran is concerned. But look what happened then. In fact, in Afghanistan itself, within basically a few months, in fact, if I remember rightly, February and March 2002, there was clearly a conflict, an insurgency developing out of what was soon to be a completely defeated Taliban. And we've then had 20 years of warfare before the Taliban won. So in other words, using that tactic then, that just didn't work. The other element is to actually think about fragmenting a state of the complexity and size of Iran in that part of the world is absolute stupidity, monumental stupidity. Apart from anything else, it's a very significant area for the use and basically of producing gas and oil. Now, I know we should be stopping doing that anyway, but we're not going to, unfortunately. The whole lobbies are too strong there. But the reality is it will wreck the economy of the West Gulf states and probably do huge damage to Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. You're to have a completely lawless state with an awful lot of very angry people in it, split up into many different factions. May look good as far as Jerusalem is concerned. It is madness as far as the rest of the world is concerned, and certainly the region itself. So I really think that as even a part of a tactic has its own big dangers built into it.
In terms of what happens next, carry on that theme. I mean, Donald Trump said the only acceptable outcome would be absolute surrender on the part of the Iranian regime, and he's talking about now. In fact, he's openly saying he's not interested in democracy. He literally said that yesterday, and he would be happy with what he calls a religious leader who is favourable to the United States and Israel and its allies. But obviously, people who know what they're talking about in terms of Iran, which is not Donald Trump, would note that within the regime, if any figure emerged which sought to capitulate, then the regime would collapse, and that person would just be removed. That was just not possible. It's an existential issue from the point of view of the regime. So you kind of wonder how this could possibly end, because if the regime doesn't do what Donald Trump is ordering it to do, which is not going to do, what happens? They just keep bombing Iran, and then what? I mean, what is the possible outcome there?
Exactly. I mean, this is the problem. They got themselves into a huge trap, and nobody appears to realize it. I'm sure there are people behind the scenes, but people don't realize that they're in this position. So until some sort of sense emerges, basically, this could go on a long time. Probably there's no other state that has sufficient clout with the United States to make the Trump administration see sense. Possibly the Chinese, nobody else, I think. And I mean, the only state of the sort of largest state in Europe which is standing up to Trump is, of course, Spain, which is fascinating to do. And they're taking quite a risk, but they're doing it. But it's interesting that, in fact, in some ways, Starmer made a point of saying that we needed a negotiated settlement almost urgently. I suspect behind the scenes, particularly in the Foreign Office, there are some very bright diplomats with a lot of experience of the region who see it more or less the way we've been describing. There's a big of a mess here. It is, as I said, just possible that the huge damage being done to ordinary people and to the structure of Iran may have an effect, and what is left of the theocratic regime might decide to do a deal. It's possible. But that is risking a huge amount. And in any case, if it does happen, then such is the dismantling of the sort of infrastructure of Iran, which is now starting in a serious way, then I think even if that does happen, what you're left behind is, a lot of anger. And if it's in any way possible, some ways of basically coming back. And this is where I think, you still have in the background that nuclear weapon problem. And it's not, of course, just Iran. Look at it this way: you have this war against, as you said, a major country with a huge history and a lot of very well-educated people, and that basically uh, is being dealt with by two countries which have nuclear weapons, and that will be, I think, a bad sign in the longer term. We're talking about 5, 10 years for the further proliferation of nuclear weapons, which is the opposite of what the world needs. In fact, I would say that's the second biggest danger to world security, from the biggest one, of course, which we all know is climate breakdown. But that's where we are. So, yes, I think one has to recognize that that's the situation which has to be met. And the best way of all is to try and get some degree of an agreement early on. That will only come, I think, if you get a change in the United States. The worry there, of course, is that within the Trump administration and many of the higher reaches in the Republican Party, you have this sort of fundamentalist Christian view that this is, some are even saying, well, this is the war towards the end of times. And that really is scary stuff. But there were credible reports recently that some quite senior military were telling their men, or their men, mostly men, obviously, that they were basically fighting for the end of the world and for everything to be achieved and all the rest. That sounds extraordinary to us. But don't forget that Christian Zionism in the United States itself is a very powerful force with 20 to 30 million people who support it, people who will tend to vote more than the average American and will tend to vote Republican. Trump may not know this, but the specialists around him will do, and they will know that there's one very good reason for preparing to continue to support Israel, and that is that, and more so when Trump is in the White House.
I mean, it's just very striking looking back to the catastrophic Western entanglements of the 21st century, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. They all, whatever we think of all of those conflicts, but they had a plan. I mean, Iraq, obviously, in my view, is a terrible crime, but I mean, they had a plan of some description.
Yeah.
What's striking about this, I think, is a few factors. There is no plan, unlike Iraq, which was a catastrophe, but it had a plan. I mean, imagine it didn't have a plan at all. Iran is a much bigger country. Iraq had a population of about 23 million, I think, when the invasion happened, and this is 93 million people. Yeah. And another, I think, striking point is there is broad-based opposition to the Iranian regime, but its base of support is actually significantly bigger than Saddam Hussein in 2003, Colonel Gaddafi in 2011, the Taliban in 2001. Yeah. It's just all of those factors together, and plus, Donald Trump. Again, whatever we think about George W. Bush, he's in a different category. All of that together, it's screaming disaster, isn't it?
It is, yes, and I think you want to put it in context. So the two contexts, one of which can be looked at possibly as positive. The contexts are, first, we've had 4 failed wars before this one. We've had Afghanistan, we've had Iraq, we've had the air war against ISIS 2014-18, which killed apparently 60,000 ISIS supporters, and of course we've had Libya. The 5th failed war, in my view, is already Gaza. We're heading for a 6th. So the one obvious thing is war ain't working. I mean, I like that Quaker postcard, which simply says, if war is the answer, it's a stupid question. And that, I think, is true. It's also worth remembering, now this is slightly off beam, I know, but what we're also seeing is the rise of protests in countries like Britain, quite a lot of it non-violent, and have all the problems of basically Palestine action and the rest. But it's worth remembering that historically, non-violent direct action, and by non-violent I mean not violent against people, sometimes against property, non-violent direct action has been very significant in some of those positive changes in the world social order. To go right back to the suffragette movements in a number of countries, including Britain, look at the effect of Gandhi bringing about earlier on the process of decolonization. You look at the civil rights movement in the United States, and you look at the one that people forget, the huge public movements that came out in 1999 in particular, sorry, 1989 in particular, when essentially the Soviet system came apart. So you don't have to just go for the military. Now, I'm not a pacifist myself. I get closer to it the older I get. But at the same time, there are other ways forward. And certainly, the very least that should happen is a serious review of how Britain looks at its security, because that is very sadly missing at the present time. But it just reminds us that at a very difficult time, there are other ways forward. And I think, at times you get fairly near despair on this one. Now, I've heard me say before, if you work in this sort of period for any length of time on terrorism and the rest, you only have three choices. You're either alcoholic, suicidal, or optimistic. And we got 7 grandchildren, and for heaven's sake, there is cause for optimism here and there, and one has to hang on to it. But at the same time, we're only going to make progress if we're realistic about the kind of mess we're in. And hopefully, there will be enough rethinking when this mess ends in some way, hopefully sooner than later, that we might start to rethink what we mean by security.
Just in terms of the US and its strategic position, Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan all weakened the US in various ways, not least militarily. It was shorn of its sense of military invincibility, which it got by the end of the Cold War, the disappearance of the Soviets as a military rival, and also the conveniently timed Gulf War of 1991, because that kind of fleshed out that sense of American military superiority just as its rival collapsed. Even though it was it was an international coalition, all the rest of it, but whatever, that's how it was presented at the time. And that was just trashed by all of those. And then obviously Gaza, what that did is, again, they'd already been the moral kind of power, which, hegemons are, it's very useful for hegemons to have this kind of, moral supremacy. That was already trashed by Iraq and so on, but Gaza just destroyed it in so many ways. What do you think about this war? What do you think could happen in terms of the weakening of an already declining hegemon?
It could increase it. I mean, I would agree very much with what you're saying. And in a sense, you can see that the United States, again, some people in the United States, even in the administration, but otherwise, of course, many people in the United States, do recognize that, in fact, the United States is in decline, primarily, though, economic decline relative to China. And also China, whatever you think of human rights in China, the one thing it is doing is moving incredibly rapidly towards a low carbon world, quite astonishingly, which I think is good for everybody. But I think the point about this is that since the United States is slipping relatively towards a weak position regarding China on the economic side, I think this is one of the reasons why the Pentagon and, of course, the arms companies have sold the idea you've got to be very strong militarily because we're not going to be able to do it economically. And I think that's really important, because one of the things we've not discussed here is there's one particular constituency which is having a whale of a time. Now, this is really Christmas has come early for the arms manufacturers, because, now thrive the armories. You had Trump calling the leading people in the American arms industries to the White House a day or two ago to say, you've got to speed up your production of the stuff we need, and they're going to do it. But I mean, the money that's going to be made out of this is huge. And so one has to accept this. And this is part of any kind of campaigning that I think people will need to do, to actually get a handle on this tendency, an economic tendency to make a heck of a lot of money out of other people's misfortune. And it's very dangerous to do in any case.
I wanted, you mentioned China before, and I just want to ask you about that as well. There was an interesting article in the Telegraph, it can happen, with the headline, "Why China is unfazed by Trump's epic fury." Epic fury, of course, being the name of the operation. And it ends, to Beijing, all this is about the fall of the West and the rise of the East. And I was struck by that, partly to declare an interest. I've written a book called The Fall of the West, which is coming out next year. Later this year in October. China was kind of labeled the main strategic rival of the United States by Trump et al. And what they're doing, his top general Dan Kane was believed to have, well, what is reported of saying he had deep concerns about a war with Iran, partly because they depleted so many of their munitions, both by arming Israel as it slaughtered Palestinians, and also Ukraine, which I thought was striking, by the way, because there's lots of certain types of hawkish American politicians who loudly cheered on arming Ukraine's defense against the Russians, not as a kind of, well, it's important, we've got to, they're being invaded, we've got to protect them, but to weaken the Russian military. They would loudly say, well, this will deplete Russian military strength. But now he was making clear, Dan Kane, that their munitions had been depleted, but now they're being even more depleted, and they've shifted their military focus, obviously, away from the Indo-Pacific. They're from the Chinese, the area of the world where China predominates. So, I mean, this is great news, isn't it, for China, from that perspective?
It is. And just to add to that, if you remember that when you actually had 9/11, and the getting rid of the Taliban, and then in early 2002, there was already talk about going for Saddam Hussein, and it took a year to get ready for that. And people said, well, reason was, they want to try and get UN agreement. It wasn't that reason. Also, the American arms companies were working 24/7 to replenish all the basic stocks because huge numbers of smart munitions have been used in the war in Afghanistan. So yes, that's a very important part of it. And essentially, it's also part of the whole area that this is a very unpredictable war. If you actually find, for example, it is possible that the Iranians have successfully kept some of their smartest munitions hidden and are hoping to deplete the munitions, the defensive munitions, then you may well find in the next week or two that suddenly the Iranians are able to use them more effectively, certainly against American bases, possibly even against the Israelis. And that's an added factor. We don't tend to think about that, but this whole business of logistics is actually extremely important here. And there may well be a chicken coming home to roost on that one.
So, I mean, do you think that whatever happens, we can't exactly sketch out the precise outcome, but that this will lead to a further weakening of US power?
It looks almost certain, unless there is a big change in the United States and quickly. And that means a change of administration. But of course, if Trump goes, it's sort of through ill health or anything. It's J.D. Vance, who in some ways is even more dangerous. And you're going to have to wait, a couple of years and a real change in the United States political system. So don't hold your breath on that one. But, one's got to hope. But I don't see it, candidly, I'm afraid.
What do you think about the prospect of ground troop involvement by the US? Because Trump is not ruling that out.
I think the only level of ground troop you get going into Iran would be special forces in very particular operations, like they tried to do in the case of Venezuela. I think it's very unlikely that will go beyond that. The problem is you might get some special force leaders in the United States. Let us get in, we can sort this out quickly, simply because there are always these conflicts between the different branches of the military. But I don't think that's going to be in any case large, because probably the Iranians, certainly some of the specialists in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, would be ready for it, and in fact would welcome it. So I think it's unlikely that the United States will take that route. It would be a very dangerous route for them to take.
Finally, the international order. Now even just saying the rules-based order, it's kind of hard to say that with a straight face, isn't it? Yeah. But it is striking, as you mentioned before, about the Iraq war in 2003. And you did say, very reasonably pointed out that whole, a year build-up, because it went on. That's a big difference here as well. There was a massive build-up, including an attempt to manipulate public opinion, which was quite successful. But they made a big song and dance about the UN. I know it was not, they went and did their illegal war anyway, but they did at least seem to think they had to go through the motions, that they had to show that they were trying to get a second resolution, for example, through the United Nations Security Council. But now we've had the Iraq war, obviously. We've had other forms of you know, we've had Israel's genocide, obviously wanton violation of international law. We had Russia's invasion of Ukraine as well. But after all this, there's nothing. I mean, is it just the law of the jungle? What happens in practice? Because you cannot credibly, after this, ever take seriously any idea of a kind of legal basis for the conduct of international relations.
Not unless we learn from the failures that are unfolding at the present time. And this is why I think it's so important for people, any people who are really worried about this, to be aware that this has got to be one of the strongest arguments going. The problem is that I don't see any significant politician around who is speaking that sort of language, with one exception, and that, of course, may surprise, but if you want to see a speech by a politician in the last 10 years, which actually looks at this and says we've got to do it differently and points to different ways, it's a speech given in Geneva, I think it's about 8 or 9 years ago, and you may not be too surprised to know, Jeremy Corbyn. And interesting, Corbyn is one of the very few people who speaks this kind of language. I wish there were more, and I wish he was listened to more. I sort of want to make that clear, my own personal view. But essentially, that kind of speech, the Geneva speech, basically is one of the few exceptions. And we want more people like that, not fewer. And this, I think, is going to be one of the most crucial things. In the absence of that, then ordinary people had to be prepared to insist that we have to do things in a different way for all our sakes. Apart from anything else, unless we do, we're all going to subject to catastrophic climate change within a couple of decades. So there's a lot to do, and it's going to be very difficult. But at the same time, it may be possible to start convincing people there has to be a different, more sensible way, because otherwise we have a very difficult period ahead of us. And I say that not personally, I won't be around, but I say we've got 7 grandchildren, and many people are looking to that as one of the real worries, and that should be a motivation to do more.
As I speak to you, my 10-month-old nephew is sitting in the other room with my twin sister. So yes, I could not agree with you more. We've got to fight to have a world worth living for that generation.
Absolutely.
Please like and subscribe, leave your thoughts, your comments. Do share the video. But Paul, honestly, it's always an honor speaking to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for allowing me the time. It's really been much appreciated. Thank you.
Always.